Hi everyone, I'm Zoe Stratus with Wilder Way Counseling and I specialize in grief, trauma, and burnout. I know this lavalier mic is best clipped to the shirt, but I get better sound this way and it gives me something to do with my hands so I don't fidget, being new to all this recording stuff. All right, be kind. So I'm here today to talk about how, in my opinion, grief is not a disorder and what does that mean for justice conscious care. So, what do we lose when grief is framed as pathology? So, for example, we will see traumatic or prolonged grief in the DSM. Um, for adults who are still experiencing the symptoms of prolonged grief, let's say more than a year after their loss, or for children, it's more than 6 months, which as a bereaved parent seems wildly ridiculous to me. A year is sort of when you're coming out of shock, the dust is starting to settle, and you might even just be starting to consider reaching out for support. A year felt like nothing to me in my loss. And so when we frame grief as pathology, we make it something that needs to be fixed, to be rushed, to be packaged up, that has an end date. We just want to get it out of there instead of honoring it as the sacred thing that it is. It is a sacred period of mourning for something or someone you loved so much that their absence, their death, profoundly changed you. We lose so many opportunities for the depth of wisdom that can be formed into your personality when grief is framed as pathology. Why does long-term grief make professionals uncomfortable? Oh yes, and I have been the recipient of many uncomfortable professionals in my own grief. And to be completely frank, there are still times as a grief therapist where it is uncomfortable. And that's okay. That's all part of the work, as a matter of fact, to sit in that discomfort, because that is exactly what I am trying to support my clients to do, to increase their distress tolerance, to find ways to integrate this grief and the love that it's made out of. So, but it often makes professionals uncomfortable because, unlike depression, anxiety, or other things you might see a counselor for, there aren't really interventions that fix it. Grief is a process that often is ongoing for life, that gets integrated into who we are and how we see the world and how we show up. And this makes professionals really uncomfortable because it can't be graded as well with rating scales of 1 to 10 of improvements on how much better do you feel now. And so feeling like somebody is paying you session after session to come to you and you are not helping them move forward, you are not fixing them in some way, can be uncomfortable for a lot of professionals, even though it's very clear in our standards of practice and our code of ethics. We're not there to fix people. We are there to provide a safe container where people can come to their own realizations and whatnot about growth. But it really does make professionals uncomfortable because, just journaling is not going to bring your baby back, because breath work isn't going to bring your spouse back. So long-term grief can make professionals really uncomfortable because they need to become so adept at then, again, just sitting with somebody in that most uncomfortable of trauma, of tragedy, of deep, deep sorrow. And this is just something that's very hard for many people, including professionals, to deal with on a long-term basis. So what happens when we try to treat love like a symptom? Right? Love is sort of essential to the human condition. And this long-term grief that many people feel after a profound loss really is an expression of love. And so when we try to treat it like a symptom, with symptom reduction, with bandages, essentially, we are disgracing one of the fundamental things that it means to be human, one of the fundamental meanings of being human, by not allowing it to speak through us, by not allowing our love and our grief to have their time and to be expressed in ways that are natural to whoever is experiencing them. We really do a disservice. We do a disservice to the person, to what they are mourning, and truly to the reverence that we should all have for life and the gratitude that we should all have for life. So love is beautiful, which means that grief is also sacred and beautiful, and trying to treat them away like they are illnesses or disorders to be rushed through just really doesn't allow them to speak fully through us and then integrate into who we are as people, how we see the world, and who we become. So that sort of also encompasses why the DSM framing feels misaligned with profound loss for me, because a year is really nothing. And there was a point when the DSM started to use the word disorder instead of response. Now, a disorder sure will sell a lot more. It will sell a lot more products that promise happiness. It will sell a lot more individualistic therapy that asks people to pull up their bootstraps and keep them coming back and coming back and coming back. This feels misaligned with profound loss to me, because for most people, profound loss is a part of life. It's going to happen to most of us at some point. And framing the restructuring of our psyches that follows profound loss as a disorder, when it is, for most of us, an inevitable experience that leads to a deep and profound understanding of ourselves, the world, and other people, this is a transformative experience. It is not a disorder. And that is why the DSM framing, for me, feels misaligned with profound loss. What is grief actually doing inside of a person? So I just spoke to that a little bit. In my mind, it is restructuring our psyches, our souls, our perception of ourselves, of other people, and of the experience of life itself. It will increase your empathy. It will make you deeper, give you such a better understanding of the human condition. Grief transforms people. That's what it's doing inside of you. So this really isn't anti-therapy. It's anti-reductionistic. We don't want to reduce grief down to just a disorder. Let's cover the distinction between grief and major depressive disorder. Grief involves waves of pain, often mixed with positive memories of the deceased. Your self-esteem is preserved and your thoughts center on the loss and the person who died. Whereas major depressive disorder features near constant negative mood and ideation, pervasive worthlessness, self-loathing, self-critical ruminations, and an inability to anticipate pleasure. Symptoms are not tied specifically to the loss, if there has been one. So grief is a natural adaptation, not a disorder unless it's prolonged grief or unless it meets the full major depressive disorder criteria. So complicated or prolonged grief versus normative grief. Normative grief is intense but time-limited, often easing within months to a year. It comes in waves, allows gradual reintegration into life, positive memories to surface, and functioning returns. It is of a culturally expected duration and intensity, generally under a year, as I said, whereas prolonged grief disorder, more than 12 months post-loss for an adult or 6 post-loss for a child. It entails intense yearning or preoccupation with the deceased, more than 3 symptoms such as identity disruption, disbelief, avoidance, numbness, meaninglessness, loneliness, and this is clinically significant impairment exceeding cultural norms and not better explained by another disorder. Normative grief resolves naturally, whereas prolonged grief is disabling, chronic, and responds best to targeted therapies. Complicated grief treatment would be one of them. I believe that grief is the soul's honest negotiation with impermanence. Normative grief teaches us to carry love lightly into tomorrow, but prolonged grief signals a stalled dialogue with eternity, inviting a gentle invitation back to the living world without betraying the dead. And this is really somewhere where therapy can really help with grief. So why grief doesn't respond to symptom-based interventions the same way that anxiety does, for example. Anxiety is a dysregulated fear, an alarm response, and symptom tools such as breathing, CBT, exposure, meds, they directly calm your amygdala and break avoidance cycles. But grief is an adaptive process of meaning reconstruction, identity renegotiation, and continuing the bond with the deceased. Symptom relief alone, like antidepressants for sadness, they leave the core existential wound unaddressed. Grief requires relational work, acceptance of permanence, rebuilding of life meaning, etc. Anxiety begs the universe for safety, and grief demands we rewrite our story with the missing chapter. Meds or other interventions, they may quiet the storm, but only presence, ritual, and time weave the beloved back into the fabric of tomorrow. What differentiates traumatic grief from non-traumatic grief? Okay? Traumatic, death, sudden, violent, unexpected, accident, suicide, homicide, disaster. These trigger PTSD features like fear, intrusive death scene memories, hypervigilance, etc., alongside the yearning. There's a higher risk of prolonged impairment. Non-traumatic tends to be expected, peaceful, anticipated, like a long illness or old age. There are primarily waves of sadness, longing, and gradual acceptance without trauma hyperarousal or event-specific intrusions. So when trauma overlays grief, trauma and grief equals traumatic grief or bereavement. Symptoms are hyperarousal, flashbacks to the death event, avoidance of trauma, reminders, fear. These coexist with the core grief, which is the yearning and the emptiness. We experience intrusive thoughts that focus on horrific circumstances of dying versus just relational memories and normative grief. A sense of powerlessness and victimhood tend to amplify both. Traumatic grief is common in sudden or violent deaths, and PTSD is fear-driven, whereas grief is loss-driven. So when death arrives clothed in terror, the heart fractures twice, once for the beloved gone, and once for the safety shattered. Trauma tends to ask, why me, while grief asks, who now? So some losses tear the veil between worlds violently, and others let us say goodbye gently. Yet every death invites the same ultimate question. How will I live now that love has changed form? So why must trauma be stabilized before grief integration? Unresolved trauma keeps the nervous system in fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Hyperarousal, dissociation, or flooding overwhelms the capacity to feel safe emotions or process loss. Standard trauma therapy has 3 phases. Safety and stabilization, which is grounding, resourcing, and nervous system regulation. The second is trauma memory processing, and the third is grief integration and life reconnection. So attempting deep grief work first risks re-traumatization. Stabilization restores our window of tolerance, so mourning can occur without collapse. So essentially, before the hurt can mourn what was lost, the body must remember it is no longer in danger. Trauma stabilization is the quiet act of reclaiming the present, so love can speak again without screaming. Now let's talk a little bit about what does research say about continuing bonds. Continuing bonds is memories, rituals, inner dialogue, symbolic acts, or sensed presence. These are common. Most bereaved people maintain them, and often adaptive, which is they provide comfort, meaning, identity continuity, and practical guidance. Like, what would my dead person want? Studies show positive association between continuing bonds and adjustment, post-traumatic growth, and reduced isolation. Modern grief theory really rejects letting go in favor of a transformation of relationship. So a nice way to look at it is that death ends a heartbeat, but never a bond. Research simply confirms what the heart has always known. We do not sever love. We learn to carry it differently, letting the beloved walk beside us and inside us in the unseen until we meet again. So how do systems and power affect grief, traumatic grief, and burnout? Well, first we have capitalism and productivity. So of course, in capitalism and productivity, grief is time-consuming, right? Grief can take you out for a really long time, and that's why, of course, there's this rush to consider it a disorder or something we want to medicate if it lasts longer than it should, over a year. It is to get people back to work. So in a society that values productivity and values the bottom line over humans, over humanity, there is so much rhetoric about moving on, about getting over grief, about getting over it, and getting back to work and getting back to normal. And in that, we just aren't held. We are just treated like an assembly line, like something broken to be fixed or shuttled off to the side. So it creates this immense timeline pressure. And if you add to that we live in a very, very individualistic culture that has a high level of promotion of toxic positivity, so we have this good vibes only culture. This isolates grieving people more. It makes them feel broken and othered in a time when, especially someone with traumatic grief, is already isolating. This good vibes only culture, this timeline pressure, this pressure to continue being productive, it tells grief that there's no room for grief. It tells you that it doesn't mean enough to take up the amount of space that it's taking up, that something's wrong with you for hurting so badly for so long. And in this way, this is how we get a cultural disenfranchisement of grief. And I think it is one of the biggest missing links that keeps us isolated and severs community, is that we have lost this grief literacy of how to be uncomfortable with each other, of how to be around people when they don't have good vibes, when they are sad, when they are enraged, when they are deeply mourning, and when everything about them has been profoundly changed by a loss. Often the response is to label them as broken or run away from them. And so these are some of the ways that the systems harm people who are grieving, traumatized, and burnt out. So how does capitalism distort healing? Well, it takes our anguish, our grief, our trauma, and it makes them just pain points to market to. So immense amount of money is made off of people being in pain, but also that it gives us the belief, because of productivity culture, that we are broken, that we are taking too long, that we shouldn't be still grieving, that we shouldn't be so affected by what happened to us, that we should be able to pull up our bootstraps and continue on. It doesn't give us the time or the space that is actually needed to integrate grief. Capitalism certainly doesn't give us the communities that we need to be held in, the relationships that we need to be held in for grief to be integrated properly. This is space that I work in, is in that relational space to be there for people for the long term, for the discomfort, without rushing to fix them. And so it used to be communities that we were naturally held in, and we gave those up for this modern way of life. And now capitalism asks us to buy back all the help and the support that we need. And so capitalism just really, it retards healing. It doesn't just distort it. And it makes us think that also that healing is some kind of an end destination that we end up getting to, rather than a lifelong integration of an experience that we've sustained. So what would justice-conscious grief care look like? Okay, well, this has to take into account so many things. We have race, we have gender, we have sexuality, we have socioeconomic class. There are so many different types of systems that play into grief, that play into trauma, that traumatize people, and that play into the deep fatigue of carrying all these things alone for too long that leads to burnout. So justice-conscious grief care looks like considering a person holistically in the context of their perception of life, their reality of their life, and the context of the world globally. What's going on geopolitically? Where are you from? What is your culture? How does it support grief? What traumatized you? Does it have to do with one of these oppressive systems? So justice-conscious grief care is really just not taking people as an isolated person that had an isolated event, but it places them in the context of their perceptions, the world, everything as a whole. And it doesn't say, this is an individual failing of yours. It says, of course, this looks like a natural response to all of these systems and all of the things that are at play in your life. In closing today, I'd like to reiterate that grief is sacred love. And if you're navigating profound loss and you want support that honors your grief rather than just trying to fix you like a broken thing, I offer one-on-one work rooted in dignity, nervous system capacity, integration, and spiritual expansion. If this sounds like something that's right for you, please find my information in the show notes. And as always, thank you so much for being here.